Albert Einstein once described his rules of work. 1. Out of clutter, find simplicity. 2. From discord, find harmony. 3. In the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. That was the kind of attitude I had to have working in Puerto Rico. It wasn't easy for me. I had to let go of my compulsive need for order and learn how to stay composed when everything seemed hopelessly out of control. The key moment for me came during a game in San German, a town in the southwest whose fans hated the Galitos so much they lit candles the night before we arrived and prayed for our death. Just before the game was about to start, someone broke a rim on one of the baskets, and everybody in the stadium, including about 5,000 fans, had to wait while the rim was being re-welded at the local gas station. It took forever. Meanwhile, the fans were getting drunk and restless, and the drums were beating louder and louder. My kids were running wild, and June was worried about Chelsea, whose leg was swollen from a spider bite. Thankfully, she recovered a few days later. I tend to get phobic in large stadiums, unless I'm down on the floor, separated from the crowd. All this craziness was making me nervous, so I retreated to the dressing room to sit zazen. It was a dark concrete room, lit by a dim bulb dangling from the ceiling. My players were so spooked by the place, they always came fully dressed for games in San German. They never told me why. I thought it had something to do with witchcraft. After sitting in the dressing room for a while, however, I spotted the reason out of the corner of my eye, a tarantula the size of a softball crawling down the wall inches from my head. In an attempt to escape one fear, I'd come face to face with, for me, an even greater fear. Ever since childhood, I've been terrified of spiders, but my mind was clear enough at that moment so that I didn't panic. I just sat there and watched the giant tarantula slowly, ever so slowly, make its way along the wall. I wanted to sit through the fear, to experience it as fully as possible, until I felt comfortable enough to just be there in the room. And I did. When I finally got up and returned to the stadium, I didn't feel anxious anymore. From then on, the riotous nature of life in Puerto Rico no longer posed a threat. And that passage is from Sacred Hoops by Phil Jackson and Hugh Delahunty. It's a book that dives deep into Phil's philosophy and also his childhood, leading all the way up to his first three-peat with the Bulls and a little bit after that. It's pretty neat because you'll see some of the scenes, or you'll read about some of the scenes that you may have seen in the documentary The Last Dance. I swear, a lot of the early stuff in this book is from that, the experiences that they had and that Phil writes about with Hugh. So it's a great book, fantastic for getting in the mind of a coach and seeing the development of a coach, which we don't see a lot. A lot of times we'll see that they won all these championships for Phil, 11 championships as a coach, 2 championships as a player, and we don't really get to see the person behind the mask. And here we do. So highly recommended book that we're going to analyze and that I suggest you read as well. Phil opens the book by saying, in basketball, as in life, true joy comes from being fully present in each and every moment, not just when things are going your way. Of course, it's no accident that things are more likely to go your way when you stop worrying about whether you're going to win or lose and focus your full attention on what's happening right now in this moment. The day I took over the Bulls, I vowed to create an environment based on the principles of selflessness and compassion I'd learned as a Christian in my parents' home, sitting on a cushion practicing Zen and studying the teachings of the Lakota Sioux. I knew that the only way to win consistently was to give everybody, from the stars to the number 12 player on the bench, a vital role on the team and inspire them to be acutely aware of what was happening, even when the spotlight was on somebody else. More than anything, I wanted to build a team that would blend individual talent with a heightened group consciousness, a team that could win big without becoming small in the process. So this is his mission statement. This is what we will look at, and what's to come in this book is everything he just said. And those 3 points are really important points to his philosophy, which is being a Christian in his parents' home. And we're going to look at his very, very extreme parents and the way that he grew up. Also discovering and practicing Zen. So practicing meditation practices, what he quoted in the first quote as sitting zazen, and a little bit of the philosophy behind that, enough to go into why he does some of these practices. And also studying the teachings of the Lakota Sioux, which was really the heart of the Bulls. Working with the Bulls, I've learned that the most effective way to forge a winning team is to call on the players' need to connect with something larger than themselves. Creating a successful team is essentially a spiritual act. It requires the individuals involved to surrender their self-interest to the greater good so that the whole adds up to more than the sum of its parts. This is the definition of teamwork. When we look at the greatest teams in the world, it may not be that they are the greatest talents in the world, but summing up all of the parts, as he says, or all the players on the team, they become greater than they could before that. And I'm a big soccer nut, so I look at, and my heritage is actually half Greek as well. So I look at the Euro Championship where Greece won the championship. They played extremely defensive and against the grain to a lot of these powerhouses, but they were able to win a championship based on becoming more than the sum of its parts. Great teams do this. The way to get there is through this next quote, which is when players practice what is known as mindfulness, simply paying attention to what's actually happening. Not only do they play better and win more, they also become more attuned with each other. And the joy they experience working in harmony is a powerful motivating force that comes from deep within, not from some frenzied coach pacing along the sidelines, shouting obscenities into the air. I can completely relate there. To succeed, the new Bulls will have to discover the selfless approach to competition that inspired their predecessors. They will have to expand their minds and embrace a vision in which the group imperative takes precedence over individual glory. And success comes from being awake, aware, and in tune with others. Like life, basketball is messy and unpredictable. It has its way with you, no matter how hard you try to control it. The trick is to experience each moment with a clear mind and open heart. When you do that, the game and life will take care of itself. There's 3 topics here that are important for players to know. 1, mindfulness, which is simply paying attention to what's actually happening rather than being in your head. Be in the present moment. And that's a lot easier said than done. There's practices that Phil will give us and practices that we can look at throughout history's tacticians that will show that. 2 is to rediscover a selfless approach. The group takes precedence over the individual. And 3, a clear mind and open heart. This is a unique approach to life where we put our heart on the line all the time. And it is so cool to get little clips from sports documentaries or from even in the game when they show halftime. And you see a player or a coach who is so passionate about what they do and the thing that they take serious in life, which is a lot of times their career, their sport, and they just open up. They lay it on the line. They cry after the game. As I said before, during halftime, there's this great Kevin De Bruyne quote where Kevin is trying to get the attention of the ref, and Pep Guardiola, his coach, who will definitely also study. Pep Guardiola is maybe the main mentor to this podcast. Maybe not. We'll see. He's going into the locker room, in through the tunnel. Pep Guardiola is saying, Kevin, trying to get his attention because he's trying to speak to the ref. And he's saying, let me talk. You can hear this on Manchester City's All or Nothing documentary that Amazon did not that long ago. Something to watch again. And something we'll get to, but that is having an open heart and the willingness to lay it all on the line. As coaches, how exactly do we signal this to the team? Phil's answer is that he has a team room at the Berto Center, which is where the Bulls train, decorated in Native American totems. He goes on to say, I had the room decorated this way to reinforce in the players' minds that our journey together each year, from the start of training camp to the last whistle in the playoffs, is a sacred quest. This is our holy sanctuary, the place where the players and the coaches come together and prepare our hearts and minds for battle. Hidden from the probing eyes of the media and the harsh realities of the outside world, this is the room where the spirit of the team takes form. Phil was extremely thoughtful with the lessons he wanted to impart to his team throughout the years, and he constantly reinforced them. He learned this from a young age. And now he's going to go into his parents. And his parents are great. I really like the way he describes them because he definitely talks about their flaws, but he talks about how, as a united force, they completely influence the road that he's going to take. He says, together, my parents formed a powerful team, working for humble wages at various parishes in Montana and North Dakota. My father was the pastor, making home visitations and delivering sermons on Sundays, while my mother taught Bible classes, played the organ, and gave fire and brimstone talks in the evening. Our lives were dictated by the rhythms of church life. In fact, in my first 4 years, we actually lived in the basement of the church until the parish could afford a parsonage. Wild. Sundays were devoted almost entirely to church activities, and we also had to attend services on Wednesday and Friday evenings. Some weeks we'd spend up to 20 hours in the pews, trying to sit perfectly still under the hawk-like gaze of mom and dad. The rules in our house were strict. We didn't have a TV, and we were discouraged from listening to rock and roll, not to mention experimenting with smoking, drinking, or sex. The point was not to just be an average Christian, but an exceptional one. So when the end of times came, we would be chosen. there's something here about not having a TV. So, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, I know, didn't like TV. The founder of Snapchat also talks about growing up without a TV, going to Montessori school, being unique. But there's a lot of histories, entrepreneurs, founders that also grew up without a TV. And I think what this does to us is it forces boredom. And boredom is really uncomfortable, but especially in today's age, it's a very, very good thing because you have to draw upon your creativity in order to make something fun. I experienced this as a kid growing up. I played soccer. It's soccer, obviously, you guys probably know already, is the sport that I choose to coach. And I run a club in the DFW area, Dallas-Fort Worth area here. But growing up, I would play wall ball and I would just take a ball and go to the brick chimney on the side of my house, and I'd make a game out of seeing how many times I could hit a particular spot. And then I'd make a game out of how many touches did I have to make in order to control a ball and have the ball in the air. I'd also run with my dogs in the backyard and see if I could beat them, which I never could. They were golden retrievers and extremely fast and agile, but I'd also dribble against them with the ball. So I just created a little soccer world in my backyard and in my side yard to negate from the boredom that I would experience as a kid if I were alone. When a parent asks me what they should try to influence inside of their child as far as getting them to kick the soccer ball on their own, I just tell them a ball and a wall. And I know it's the hardest thing to hear. A lot of parents want private lessons, or they have great coaches. Honestly, you're going to get so much more by making something up in 10 or 15 minutes every single day than you will with an hour for a private coach. So again, I'm off my soapbox a little bit. Just wanted to say that being bored instigates becoming imaginative. And imagination is huge in athletes and just in creative people in general. So Phil focuses on sports growing up, especially basketball. He says, one reason for my early success was my fierce competitive drive, honed over the years by battling two older brothers at everything from checkers to one-on-one hoops. Charles and Joe, 6 and 4 years older respectively, made fun of me, and I tried to compete with them. And their laughter drove me to even try harder. No doubt I inherited some of that spirit from my mother, who was a basketball player in high school and turned every activity, ironing shirts, playing Scrabble, hiking with her Sunday school class, into an Olympic sport. For me, winning was a matter of life and death. So not only this, but he would program his mind with verse upon verse from the Bible because his mother told him that the idle mind is the devil's playground. His mother is an extremely spiritual person and extremely Christian. She has a voluminous memory, he says, and loved to argue. She's also extremely competitive, as we've seen before. His father, on the other hand, has more of a feminine role. He's explained as a warm, compassionate man with a view of life based on a literal translation of the King James Version of the Bible. Now, there's a story about a runaway pickup truck when Phil and his two brothers are younger that actually hits his father. And his father didn't sue because, quote unquote, it wasn't the Christian thing to do. His father was extremely strict with him as he grew up in a strict household. Phil remembers being, I believe it's hit, paddled once, but he remembers that his older brother, Joe, who we'll talk about a lot here in just a second, being paddled more. And his father, that every time he would paddle the boys, he would cry. So it's not that his father liked doing it. It's probably that his father was raised that way and he didn't know any other way to raise them. But again, there is something about being raised in a strict household and being told not to do more things than to do. Having these boundaries and having these rules, we know what we can do as kids growing up within those rules. And a lot of times it's not a lot. So we have to choose something that is close to our heart, and something that's close to Phil's heart is, one, being a good Christian, but second will be basketball and sports in general. He's also a very good baseball player too, that we'll see. Phil's turning point when he was a kid was there's this need in the Pentecostal faith, which is what Phil and his parents are, that they have to at some point, or the main goal, especially as a teenager, is to experience the Holy Spirit physically, meaning that they want to speak in tongues. So there's this experience that he has where he says that over and over and over again, he's watching his friends speak in tongues. And he just doesn't understand because he's constantly at church. He's constantly memorizing lines in the Bible, but the Holy Spirit just won't come to him. And he's not willing to sacrifice his honest nature, and just start babbling essentially a bunch of nothing to do this and to look good. So when he's 15, he becomes disillusioned and he channels all of his energy into basketball. And his mom is extremely upset about this. And he confides in her about not being able to. And she tells him that she wishes he wouldn't say that because basically she wants him to be not only a good Christian, but he is in line to become a pastor because of how good he is at memorizing text. And I think this will actually help him later on because he becomes a lifelong learner and a lifelong reader. So Phil does really, really well in high school basketball, so much so he's recruited to the University of North Dakota. And at the University of North Dakota, not only does he play basketball, but he also plays baseball because, you know, uber athletes and people that are obsessed with things can't put things down. They can't put sports down. And we'll see that later with Michael Jordan, right? He's playing baseball, and his freshman year, he ends up hearing a pop in his elbow after throwing his 80-mile-per-hour heater, which back then must have been a heater and nowadays would be child's play. But he throws it, hears a pop in his elbow, and his brother, Joe, who we talked about before, his brother was more of the rascal than him. He suggests self-hypnosis to get his rhythm back after he heals from his injury. So Phil does this and comes back to pitching a short time later. He realizes he doesn't need to force things, which is the first time in athletics that he realizes he doesn't need to play kind of power ball in a way. So he says he focused on the act of throwing the ball and letting the motion flow naturally. Not only did the nagging pain in my shoulder miraculously disappear, but I also experienced something new for me, near perfect control. This was my introduction to the hidden power of the mind and what I could accomplish if I could turn down the chattering in my head and simply trust my body's innate wisdom. Here he focuses on his own technique and he lets the winning take care of itself. With his competitive nature comes the need to win. He says, my obsession with winning was often my undoing. I would push so hard to succeed when things weren't going my way that it would hurt my performance. That's the lesson I learned after my self-hypnosis session with Joe. I was trying to force my body to cooperate, and when it didn't respond, my mind became even more insistent. But on the pitcher's mound that day, I discovered that I could be effective, even overcome pain, by letting go and not thinking. It was an important turning point for me. After this, his brother Joe introduces him to Zen Buddhism. Phil declares his college majors his sophomore year to be psychology, philosophy, and religion. He, Joe, encouraged me to take a detached look at the belief system I had been spoon-fed since childhood and explore life more freely. So as we said before, he was recruited to play basketball, and his first coaching mentor is a man named Bill Fitch. Fitch was a stern taskmaster who taught me discipline and how to play without fear. I wasn't exactly a selfless player. I had a tendency to try and score every time I got the ball, without even looking to see if one of my teammates had a better shot. But that didn't worry Fitch as long as I played selflessly when it really counted, executing his trademark full-court press. So this is his first experience of selflessness, really. I mean, I know he's worked on teams before, but it seems here he mentions it for the first time for a reason. And it's the first time on a basketball court for sure. But the 60s culture once again supports this with teachings of compassion and what he says is brotherhood now, which means that it's not later, it's not something that we reflected on the past, it's not something that we're trying to get to at a future point, it is now. Phil obviously really blends and gels well with this full court press defense. He does it so well that he becomes an All-American in his junior year, scoring 21.8 points. And not only that, but he does the same thing as far as becoming an All-American again his senior year. So this puts him on the radar to be drafted. And he is drafted by the New York Knicks. During this time, Phil also gets married to his first wife in 1967. Her name is Maxine, and they have a child named Elizabeth as well. Phil has this great first experience with his first NBA coach for the Knicks. His name's Red Holzman. And this is what he says. He says, on my first visit to New York, Holzman and his wife, Selma, picked me up at the airport. As we were driving along the expressway into Manhattan, a teenager threw a rock at the car from an overpass and smashed the windshield. Red was furious. I expected him to turn around and chase after the kid, but when he realized that nobody was hurt, he lightened up. "Well, that's New York City, Phil," he said, brushing off the incident. "If you can take that, you'll do just fine here." Thus began my course in the Holzman School of Management. And here are 3 lessons from the Holzman School of Management. Lesson 1, don't let anger or heavy objects thrown from overpasses cloud the mind. Holzman was no Eastern philosopher, but he understood instinctively the importance of awareness in building championship teams. Playing under him, I transformed from a me-first hotshot into a multi-dimensional team player with a deeper understanding of the inner game of basketball. The lessons I learned from Red provided the foundation for the selfless approach to teamwork that I would later develop with the Bulls. Red took over as a coach of the Knicks in the middle of my rookie year, and it was clear from the first practice what he was looking for. He wanted us to be in tune with each other and what was happening on the court at all times. That was true even if you were riding the bench. Once during a timeout at the end of a game, I was goofing around on the sidelines with backup center Nate Bauman, when Red suddenly stormed down the floor, stuck his nose in my face, and asked, "How much time is left, Jackson?" "A minute and 28 seconds, I said. "No. How much time is left on the 24-second clock?" I don't know." "Well, you've got to know, because you may be going into the game, and if you don't know the time, you could get us in trouble. Don't let me catch you doing that again." He didn't. Lesson 2 from him. Awareness is everything. Holzman was a master of defense. In fact, during that first practice, he had us running up and down the floor, applying full court pressure. Red believed that hard-nosed defense not only won big games, but also, and more importantly, forced players to develop solidarity as a team. On offense, a great scorer can often dominate a game, and players frequently place their own individual goals of pumping up their scoring average ahead of what's best for the team. But on defense, everybody has the same mission: stopping the enemy. And you can't get far trying to do it single-handedly. The Knicks were so loaded with good shooters: Walt Frazier, Bill Bradley, Cassie Russell. Holzman didn't concern himself about offense. He let us design our own play. We had the D play for Dave Dubucher, sorry, I know I'm butchering that name, to set him up for an easy outside shot. And for Bradley, we ran the Princeton Tiger play, which he had used in college when he was being double and triple teamed. What was important to Holzman was that we keep the ball moving and not let 1 or 2 players get all the shots. As a result, we often had 6 to 8 players in double figures. Lesson 3. The power of we is stronger than the power of me. To survive on the Knicks, I had to carve out a new role for myself. Coming off the bench, I couldn't be the man anymore. So I focused on improving my defense. Luckily, Holzman's high-pressure style of defense came easily to me because it resembled Bill Fitch's. So both of Phil's coaching mentors so far emphasize defense, which I think is important because later on he's so known for the triangle offense, even though he wasn't the inventor. Some people don't know that. I mean, most of you probably do. That was Tex Winter that came up with that triangle offense. But we're seeing now what we could call maybe the foundation also of what his future Bulls had, which was a lot of intensity, a lot of full court press, and it was very hard for other teams to deal with. And not just that later on, but they also have a mission. They know exactly the types of movements to make when they do have their devastating offense and they do have positive transitions, meaning that they win the ball back and they're going straight to the hoop. Now, in Phil's second season as a player, he has something unexpected come, which he has a spinal injury happen. And he's going up. He says he jumps up, he lands funny, and he goes tumbling down, and he injures his spine. Now, a surgical fusion is needed, so he's out for a very, very long time. He's out for the rest of the season and the next season. He says the pain was excruciating, and many of my standard options for distracting myself were off limits. Basketball was out. Sex was out. Overnight, Action Jackson had become Traction Jackson. To entertain myself, I began observing my thoughts and trying to figure out what made my mind click. What I discovered was a mountain of guilt. I felt guilty about my back injury, which could have easily ended my career. I felt guilty about my marriage, which had been showing signs of strain ever since Maxine and I had moved to New York. I felt guilty about not spending enough time with my daughter. Though I still occasionally went to church, I felt guilty about distancing myself from my parents and my spiritual heritage. Why did I put so much pressure on myself? Would I ever be able to escape all those years of Bible school conditioning? Obviously, I wasn't as liberated as I thought. So this is an elite athlete who does mindfulness and meditation practices. He's a deep thinker. Imagine the average athlete we have on our teams, right? You and I having, I don't know what you coach, but perhaps you coach youth like I do, and having a 15-year-old boy or a 13-year-old girl having to deal with this stuff unconsciously. For him, it's conscious because he does the practice, he does the work, and he's older, right? But even if you have a 35-year-old man who's transitioning out of professional sports and into life, it's hard to navigate these waters. It's not only hard, but it's what that person has known their entire life. And so that transition itself is needed. There's a lot of support needed for that transition from family, from friends, from the people around. Not only that, but maybe from counseling as well. I mean, just look at some of the greatest players in the world when they had injuries or they have these transitions. It can be terrible, terrible for them. My question to you is, for your athletes and for my athletes too, like, what do we think their anxiety, their fear, their guilt levels, and their general unconsciousness is towards things like this, right? So it takes an injury in order for Phil to start to reflect, to start to sit in meditation more, to start to uncover the, as he calls it, the mountain of guilt that he has within him. And this is really where his first experience with coaching comes. He says, when my injury healed, the Knicks decided to keep me off the roster for the 1969-70 season to protect me from the expansion draft. During that period, Holzman adopted me as his assistant coach ex officio. And I don't know if you know, but during this time, assistant coaches really weren't a thing. So I'll pick up back on the quote here. I practiced with the team, scouted upcoming opponents, and discussed strategy with Red before and after games. I learned how to look at the game from the perspective of what the whole team was doing and to conceptualize ways to disrupt an opponent's game plan. In short, I began to think like a coach. This is where his visualization practices come in as well. After he comes back from his injury, he says, when I came back the next year, I knew I would no longer be able to rely solely on talent to carry me through. I would have to use my mind more effectively to offset my loss of flexibility and quickness. Ultimately, the key would be to increase my level of awareness. My teacher was Bill Bradley. Unlike Deboucher, who looked to take it easy in practice, Bradley demanded constant attention. He wasn't that fast, but he had an uncanny sense of court awareness. If your mind wandered for a millisecond, he'd vanish into thin air, then reappear on the other side of the court with a wide open shot. Covering him in practice showed me just how weak my powers of concentration were. I'd been a center in college and by instinct focused on following the ball and protecting the basket. But Bradley was such a great player off the ball. I had to learn how to attach myself to him without being distracted and losing track of what was happening on the rest of the floor. To train myself to be relaxed and fully alert, I began practicing visualization. I would sit quietly for 15 or 20 minutes before the game in a secluded part of the stadium. My favorite place was the New York Rangers locker room, and create a moving picture in my mind of what was about to happen. I'd call up images of the man I was going to cover and visualize myself stopping his moves. That was the first part. The next step, which was much harder, was to lay back and not try to force the action once the game started, but to allow it to unfold naturally. Playing basketball isn't a linear thought process. Okay, when Joe Blow takes that funny drop step over there, I'm going to jump in and do my best Bill Russell imitation. The idea was to code the image of a successful move into my visual memory so that when a similar situation emerged in a game, it would seem, to paraphrase Yogi Berra, like deja vu all over again. Phil and the Knicks are having success this season. It's the 1971-72 season, and he says that a turning point came in the fifth game of the 1971-72 playoffs in Boston. Bradley had been having trouble guarding the Celtics' crafty Don Nelson, so Holzman put me on him. One of Nelson's tricks was to load up his fingers with pine tar resin so that the ball would stick to his fingers when he faked a shot. This was maddening for me because I had a quick trigger in blocking shots. To beat him, I had to pick the move apart in my head, step by step, then try to remain clear-headed so that when he finally made his move, I would recognize the moment and do what I had to do. It worked. The first time Nelson tried to fake me out in that game, I didn't get tense and overreact because I knew what was going to happen. That clarity allowed me to stick with him and throw him off his game, creating some important scoring opportunities for us that helped seal the victory. So they win the playoffs. New York plays Los Angeles in the finals in the 71-72 year, and New York wins. And you would think that after winning the championship, that Phil Jackson would be celebrating. It would be, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And not that he didn't. I'm sure that he did. But he says that after the series, the finals against LA seemed anticlimactic. Chamberlain was ineffective, and we flew past the Lakers in 5 games to clinch the title. The post-game festivities in LA were exhilarating. This was the pinnacle of my sports career to that point, the moment I had been striving for with all my heart since I was a kid. And yet 2 days later, when we gathered again in New York for a celebration with family and friends at Tavern on the Green, suddenly the thrill was gone. The room was crowded with celebrities. Robert Redford held court in one corner, Dustin Hoffman in another. But the intense feeling of connection with my teammates I had experienced in LA seemed like a distant memory. Instead of being overwhelmed with joy, I felt empty and confused. Was this it? I kept saying to myself. Is this what was supposed to bring me happiness? Clearly, the answer lay somewhere else. And again, we'll ask the question, how many athletes feel this way? How many can't articulate it? He can articulate it reflecting back, and I do wonder if he could articulate it in the moment. It seems like he could based on the choices that he makes afterwards. But how many others express it in ways that negatively affect their career? I'm thinking of, once again, a Manchester City player, Jack Grealish, who after winning the treble, after four-peating, a thing that had never been done in English European football, he kind of goes off the rails, and for 18 months to 2 years, he's just not the same player that he is. Dennis Rodman, someone who we'll speak about a little bit later, but not maybe emphasize in this podcast at least, after he wins the 2 championships with the Detroit Pistons, the bad boys at the time, he goes off the rails and he gets traded to the Spurs. He lacks motivation. And later on in the Bulls, he has the same thing. He wins championships and he's just trying to figure out the motivation to play this game with a ball. He just doesn't have it. Phil eventually recognizes what he's missing. He says, "What I was missing was spiritual direction. The unfulfilled legacy of my devout childhood had left an emptiness, a yearning to reconnect with the deeper mysteries of life." His marriage falls apart in 1972. He doesn't want to commit himself to his marriage or his family life, he says. He moves into an apartment in Brooklyn and develops a friendship with the person he purchases the apartment from, a man named Hakeem. They often will check in on each other's spiritual progress and have meals together. He says one evening during a moment of quiet reflection, Hakeem told me he had a vision of my childhood. "I see you as a little boy sitting in a high chair. You want to eat with your left hand, but your mother is forcing you to use your right. She's hovering over you, shoving the spoon into your right hand and making sure you use it. Meanwhile, your father's in the background, smiling and allowing it to happen." Hakeem had never met my parents, but he understood the dynamic in my family life with uncanny accuracy. When I was little, my mother tried to force me to submit to her will, cramming my head with Bible passages, making me eat with my right hand instead of my left, while my father looked on benignly and loved me unconditionally, no matter what I did. It struck me, listening to Hakeem, that I had inherited my mother's mind and my father's heart, and those 2 sides of my character were still in conflict. The part of me that was like my mother, always searching for logical answers, always trying to exert control, usually won out over the part that, like my father, was moved with compassion, trusting the song in my heart. Phil's dad tells him after leaving an argumentative conversation on faith that arguing isn't where the faith is. That just feeds the ego. It's all in the doing. To him, there were certain mysteries that you could only understand with the heart, and intellectualizing about them was a waste of time. He accepted God on faith and lived his life accordingly. This was an important lesson for me. So here we also have Castaneda's quote by his mentor, Don Juan. He says, "Look at every path closely and deliberately. Try it as many times as you think necessary. Then ask yourself, and yourself alone, the question, does this path have a heart? If it does, the path is good. If it doesn't, it is of no use." And so here Phil starts to explore many different spiritual paths. And to his surprise, he becomes more intrigued about taking another look at his own spiritual roots. Joseph Campbell describes this as the hero's journey, really, because it's a circular path. Not that his journey is over at all, not that it's even over with spirituality, but he is having kind of like a mini circle, really, and he is viewing his own spirituality from when he was back as a child, not as this like monkey on his back or this thing he needs to look negatively on, but as possibly having things that he didn't see the first time. And he becomes disciplined with meditation in the mid-70s. He says, "What appealed to me about Zen was its emphasis on clearing the mind. As the Buddha put it in the Dhammapada, everything is based on mind, is led by mind, is fashioned by mind. If you speak and act with a polluted mind, suffering will follow you. As the wheels of an ox cart follow the footsteps of the ox. If you speak and act with a pure mind, happiness will follow you, as a shadow clings to a form." But the Zen idea of a polluted mind is quite different from the traditional Christian perspective, which dictates that impure thoughts be rooted out and eliminated. What pollutes the mind in the Buddhist view is our desire to get life to conform to our peculiar notion of how things should be, as opposed to how they really are. In the course of everyday life, we spend the majority of our time immersed in self-centered thoughts. Why did this happen to me? What would make me feel better? If only I could make more money, win her heart, make my boss appreciate me. The thoughts themselves are not the problem. It's our desperate clinging to them and our resistance to what's actually happening that causes us so much anguish. As a basketball player, this made a lot of sense to me. I knew from experience I was far more effective when my mind was clear and I wasn't playing with an agenda of some kind, like scoring a certain number of points or showing up one of my opponents. The more skilled I became at watching my thoughts in Zazen, the more focused I became as a player. As Phil's meditation focus gets better, he is better focused as a player. And it's when he becomes mindful of his thoughts as well, this is when his mind quiets down, and he's equating that with not just being a better basketball player, but being a better person in general. He says that Yogi Berra once said, "How can you think and hit at the same time?" I love these little Yogi Berra quotes inside of this book because they're like little Zen koans. Or little riddles. And yeah, it reminds me a lot of what Johan Cruyff would say. Johan Cruyff, the famous Dutch footballer and coach of Barcelona, Ajax, he never coached the Netherlands, but they wished he did. He would say things like, playing football is simple. Playing simple football is the hardest thing you can do. And I just love those little things because they're very quotable and they're very relatable. So for Phil, he says the key is seeing and doing. If you're focusing on anything other than reading the court and doing what needs to be done, the moment will pass you by. There's also this famous running coach. He's a New Zealand guy. His name is Arthur Lydiard, and he came up with modern jogging. He's training one of his runners one day, and they're at a university, and a group of athletes from the university come up to him and ask him how many laps his runner intends to do. And he's not sitting there with a stopwatch or anything. And Arthur Lydiard says, "I don't know." And the kids say, "How fast is he running?" And he says, "I don't know." And so then when the runner stops, these university students say, "What was your time?" And the runner says, "I don't know." And they say, "Well, how far did you go?" And he says, "I don't know." And what Arthur's basically saying to them, or what he's explaining here, is often we do our best when we don't track how far we go. And that's in terms of running, but it's also in terms of basketball and stuff too. When they talk with Michael Jordan a lot, it's not as if he's saying, "Okay, I'm going to go out there and score 80 points this game." He's just focused on scoring in the moment, focused on how he can get to the basket, focused on how he can help his teammates. He is extremely in the moment. And Phil will say that later, that he thinks that Michael is one of the best Zen practitioners in the world. Phil says, sitting Zazen, I learned to trust the moment, to immerse myself in action as mindfully as possible so that I could react spontaneously to whatever was taking place. When I played without putting a head on top of a head, I found that my true nature as an athlete emerged. It's not uncommon for basketball players, especially young ones, to expend a great deal of mental energy trying to be somebody they're not. I discovered that I was far more effective when I became completely immersed in the action, rather than trying to control it and fill my mind with unrealistic expectation. So then, this is good for the individual, right? But then we've got to ask as coaches, What binds our teams together? And here, Phil also says, like, first, he basically needs to bind his mind together. So he says, merging Zen and Christianity allowed me to reconnect with my spiritual core, and it began to integrate my heart and mind. Compassion is not exactly the first quality one looks for in a player, but as my practice matured, I began to appreciate the importance of playing with an open heart. Love is the force that ignites the spirit and binds teams together. Obviously, there's an intellectual component to playing basketball. Strategy is important, but once you've done the mental work, there comes a point when you have to throw yourself into the action and put your heart on the line. That means not only being brave, but also being compassionate towards yourself, your teammates, and your opponents. This idea was an important building block of my philosophy as a coach. More than anything else, what allows the Bulls to sustain a high level of excellence was the players' compassion for each other. Phil actually ends up winning 2 championships with the Knicks. In 1978, he gets traded to the New Jersey Nets. And this is around the latter part of his career. So I know we've skipped a lot, but Phil tends to be this way. It is a very philosophical book that he has. And he says that when he gets traded to the New Jersey Nets, his third coaching mentor, Kevin Laffery, I had to look that up, the pronouncing, because it looks like Lowry, is a coach in New Jersey. Towards the end of training camp that year, the Nets coach, Kevin Laffery, asked me to go for a ride with him in his car. I was 33 at the time, and the Nets were loaded with young, talented players. I figured Laffery was going to cut me, but he threw me a curve. Basically, Phil, we're in a difficult situation, he said. You've had a good run, and I hate to tell anyone he's through playing ball. But I'd like you to stay here as an assistant coach. We've got a lot of young kids who don't know how to play yet. I'd like you to dress for practices and play against them, just in case we need you for a game. But mostly I want you to be a coach. This begins Phil's death as a player and rebirth as a coach. Phil Jackson agrees to do this, and he learns a lot from Laffery. He says that Laffery had a subtle intuitive gift and often surprised me with his insights about the team. During the 1978-79 season, the Nets got off to the best start in the history of the franchise. But Laffery was skeptical. He felt that early success had spoiled the players, and nobody was listening to him anymore. One night after a home game, he told the general manager he wanted to quit. Laffery was right. The Nets were a flashy, fast-starting team that didn't have the courage or desire to go all the way. They would fade early that year, just barely making the playoffs with a 37-45 record. And there's a funny story here that when Laffery is saying, like, hey, I want to quit, and they have the best record, the owner of the team, or perhaps it's the team manager, comes to him and says, Laffery, like, we've got the best record ever for our franchise. Like, we are doing really well. And he says, no, it's just not good vibes. They're not listening to me. I want to quit. And the team manager eventually says, okay, well, who's going to fill your place? And he goes, I don't know. Phil could do it. And Phil Jackson actually says, he goes, I had the balls to say that I could do it, which was ridiculous at the time. So I like the fact that Phil wants to do that, that he has the guts to do it and he has this can-do attitude. And at the same time, reflecting back, it's funny to hear, and it's really neat also to see the lessons that he learns from him. But it is neat to hear, like, I had no idea what I was doing back then. I tell people a lot, like for me, for coaching, that I have we're very principled at our club, and the kids that I coach, we have a team identity, game model, all that stuff. And at the same time, I would like to think that in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, I look back on myself and say, gosh, I was an idiot. How stupid was I? Maybe that has to do with the psychology as well of how I interacted with kids too, not just the game model or the principles and all that stuff, but that's what I hope for myself. And I feel like Phil a little bit is saying that here too. Now, during this period of time, Phil's father dies in 1979. And there's actually a really beautiful passage that Phil has here, not just commemorating or reflecting on his father, not that actually at all really, but the freedom that he experiences after his father dies, which, how unique is that, right? It's like a lot of the Greek myths talk about this, that basically the son can only become his own man once the father dies. And they've got some pretty bloody occurrences of it. But here it is, like living in the flesh of a natural death and of Phil celebrating it in a different way. So he says, though I sorely missed him, my father's death had a liberating effect on me. As long as he was alive, I felt a certain pressure to keep up appearances. He was a respected minister, and I didn't want to embarrass him by not going to services, particularly during the off season when I spent a lot of time in Montana. It wasn't until he died that I felt that I could finally break from my past without guilt and become more fully myself.
Phil retires from his playing career of basketball shortly after his father's death. And you would think naturally he would go into coaching right away, but he actually doesn't. He moves to Montana and he runs a health club for a year, which he says he hates, which is not surprising. In 1982, he begins his coaching career with the Albany Patroons in the CBL. He's offered a job, he moves there, and this is really where he begins to share or apply his spiritual wisdom with his players as a coach. He says, I wanted to create a team in which selflessness, not the me-first mentality that had come to dominate professional basketball, was the primary driving force. My goal was to find a structure that would empower everybody on the team, not just the stars, and allow the players to grow as individuals as they surrendered themselves to the group effort. To mold the Patroons into a selfless team, I arranged for everybody to receive the same salary, $330 a week, and distributed playing time more democratically. We had 10 players on the roster, so I divided the team into 2 5-man units, the first and second teams, and rotated them into the games as units in 8-minute intervals. For the last 8 minutes, I'd use a unit made up of the players who had the hottest hands that day. Giving everybody playing time helped diffuse a lot of the petty jealousy that usually fragments teams. It worked so well, in fact, that it became one of my trademarks as a coach. I try to work all 12 players on the roster into the rotation to keep everybody's mind focused on the same goal. So this relates a little bit to a concept in a book called Think and Grow Rich. The more minds focused on a particular goal, the better and the more powerful, right? So their goal is to win games. If they have the first 5 people playing 80% of the game and the last 5 or 7 playing 20% of the game, that's not going to lend to a very good atmosphere, one. It's going to lend to people on the bench thinking about other things rather than the basketball game. But when you know that you're going to be playing for 8 minutes and then you're out for 8 minutes and then you have to play again, on the bench, you're going to be paying attention to what's going on because you have to. Otherwise, you're not just letting yourself down, you're letting the team down. Phil says that one of the things I learned in the CBA was how important it is to inspire players to commit to the team effort, even though everything else was pushing them in another direction. I constantly had to figure out ways to get the player to strengthen their commitment. When Vince Lombardi was a basketball coach at Fordham in the early 1940s, he used to have his players make a pledge before each practice. He'd stand them behind the end line and say, God has ordained me to teach you young men about basketball today. I want all those who want that training to step across the line. This wasn't just an empty symbolic gesture. Lombardi understood the power of making a conscious act of commitment. That's why he wanted his players to cross that line every day. Now, I laugh a little bit there because I was like, well, Vince Lombardi, basketball coach, I didn't know he coached basketball. So I also realized the time he coached football was not during the early 1940s. So he actually coached basketball first when I looked this up. And it was directly after college. And I thought, well, maybe since Phil's sharing this, that he was a successful basketball coach, Vince Lombardi was. He wasn't. It wasn't successful at all. And he later reflected that the coach needs to have a better understanding, technically and tactically, of what's happening in the designated sport. Vince Lombardi had always wanted to coach football. It's another coach that we will pick apart and we will analyze here on Tacticians. Not today, though. But again, just kind of a funny thing there. Whenever I read that quote, I kind of laugh a little bit because although maybe that worked a little bit as far as commitment, it did not work on the score sheet at all. Phil says that players in the CBA are trying to get back in the NBA. And so that's the culture that he has there. So a lot of times it will be more me first than we first. It can influence a more selfish style of play. But what Phil says happened for him is he says that as I got to know them, the team, better, however, I found that most of them resonated with the idea of surrendering to something larger than themselves. Though their behavior on the court often indicated otherwise, most of them secretly yearned to connect with the group and were willing to sacrifice their desire for star status in order to help the team win. This is when Charlie Rosen joins the staff. And Charlie Rosen is a character. He's like the negative mind to Phil's positive mind. In those days, they didn't have assistant coaches, as I said before. So he came in as like the team doctor. So he dressed in all white. And Phil said he looked like the ice cream man at the time. So imagine this very tall, I think he says he's 6'4" man dressed in all white with a ball cap as well, running onto the court from time to time. What they're focused on mainly, Phil and Charlie, are ways in which they can revolutionize basketball. And when Charlie Rosen decides to join the staff, they are in Woodstock. Like they live in Woodstock, which he says helped because of the liberal mindset that was in Woodstock at the time. He says that the identity of the team and of all teams often develops slowly and unexpectedly. This is another indicator to release control. Rosen, one night, they're playing and the team gets into a fight, and Rosen actually runs onto the basketball court. Now, this is a middle-aged man running onto a basketball court with a bunch of 20-somethings, and he's yelling at the other players and at his players, "If you don't stop doing that, I'm going to kick your ass." He says Rosen looked ridiculous doing that, but that incident showed Phil just how effective humor can be as a catalyst for deepening team spirit. Later on, Phil reflects whenever Scottie Pippen is having this feud with Jerry Krause, Scottie Pippen's having contract issues, and so there's kind of a heavy gloom over the team because Scottie Pippen is the number 2 player on the team. He's really, and this has been said a bunch of times, or he is the Robin to Michael's Batman. So Phil, one day, Scottie's kind of sulking, and Phil asks, "So Scottie, what do you think we can get for Krause?" And Scottie laughed because there's this thought of like some, again, older, very short, very portly man running and playing on like the San Antonio Spurs, which gets Scottie to laugh. The gloom lifted, and it not only lifted from Scottie, but it lifted from the entire team, and that had been happening for days. So humor can have a big effect, and Phil learns that here. Phil is a lifelong learner. This is called an autodidact. You'll see that term come up a lot with coaches that we study. Their hobbies and interests go way beyond the sport they coach, and they're influenced by it. Phil has a knack to admit when he's wrong and adjust from there, which is another huge, huge aspect of being a very adaptable coach. His mindfulness and meditation practices help him to reflect and change rather than getting into ego wars with players. He says, "I was far more effective as a coach when I balanced the masculine and feminine sides of my nature. I learned early that one of the most important qualities of a leader is listening without judgment, or with what Buddhists call bare attention. Many of the men I've coached have come from troubled families and needed all the support they could get. I find that when I can be truly present with impartial, open awareness, I get a much better feel for the player's concerns than when I try to impose my own agenda. And paradoxically, when I back off and just listen, I get much better results on the court." In the Tao of Leadership, John Hyder writes, "The wise leader is of service, receptive, yielding, following. The group member's vibration dominates and leads, while the leader follows. But soon it is the member's consciousness which is transformed. It is the job of the leader to be aware of the group member's process. It is the need of the group member to be received and paid attention to. As coaches, we must listen and adapt in game. The plan goes in the can. A new plan must be formed in the chaos," right? So in 1984, Phil gets a job in Puerto Rico coaching over the summer after winning the CBA championship with the Patroons. Red Holzman, Tex Winter, Johnny Bach, Casey Jones, and Sam Jones all worked in this league at one point in time. Phil, so you think, okay, well, Phil has had this illustrious career when we look at the end and we look back on it. But Phil is actually fired 3 weeks after arriving because the star player didn't like his basketball philosophy. But the neat thing is that the team owner of that team that fired him lines up another job for him coaching the Isabela Gallitos. He says the players in Puerto Rico love the game, and their connection with each other was stronger than on any team I've ever coached. Players rarely got traded or dumped, and there seemed to be a party every week for members of the extended family. Not all players spoke English, so I had to learn how to teach and communicate nonverbally. I also had to adapt to the Puerto Rican concept of time. In Albany, I had a rule that if you missed practice, you'd have to sit out the next game. If I did that in Puerto Rico, we would have had to default the whole season. Once the players were on the floor, however, they threw themselves in the game with unbridled energy. Sometimes they played in such a frenzy that all I could do was sit back and watch. Phil has many great experiences in Puerto Rico. He returns to the Patroons after that summer and egos start to erupt. The team is performing well that season with the best record in the league heading into the playoffs. And he has this player named Frankie Sanders, who in the book, they talk about a little bit. They focus a lens a little bit because Phil has a player as well that he wants to start above Frankie. But that player comes up to him and says, hey, I really think Frankie needs to start over me. And Phil does that, and they have a lot of success. But Frankie Sanders later on, after having this success, becomes more and more a me-first guard, and he demands a substantial pay raise. The man who ran the team at the time buckles and gives him the raise. Sanders then tries to control other aspects of the team because once you give in to one thing, you have problems in other areas, right? So Phil suspends Sanders, but then reinstates him because the owner called him an ass. And he says that he sacrifices his principle here. And this is where we learn Phil's first law of leadership. He says, above all, trust your gut. Once you've made your move, you have to stand by your decision and live with the consequences because your number one loyalty has to be to the team. In the case of Sanders, I compromised my principles to placate my boss. And the players picked up on my ambivalence immediately. The solidarity that had taken so long to build suddenly evaporated. Not only did we lose the series, we were lost as a team. After that experience, I decided to split up the team and start all over again. It was time, I told the players, to get off the CBA treadmill and look for jobs in Europe, where they could make good money and not be haunted by an NBA dream wish. I thought it would be easy to find replacements, but the competition for talent had taken a nasty turn in the CBA. Musselman's success that year, winning his first of a record 4 straight titles, encouraged other coaches to follow his lead and stock their teams with NBA veterans. Some owners were offering players $1,000 and $1,500 a week and slipping them illegal cash bonuses on the side. Overnight, what used to be a training league for young players had turned into a cutthroat business where the owners were obsessed with winning and most of the players were cynical and self-absorbed. I wondered how long I could last. The team I pieced together was composed primarily of CBA lifers who weren't that receptive to my experiments with communal basketball. Discipline became a chore. We weren't spending as much time together off court, in large part because we were flying to most of our games instead of taking the van. So it's cool too here because often these tools that we use as professional teams, such as vans, or as college teams such as buses, or as high school teams such as vans, actually bring us together. And we say, oh man, like that trip, that 6 or 7 hour trip to Pennsylvania that we have to take a bus to, where we have the boys team in one bus and the girls in another, or both sometimes together, right, as a college team. Say, man, that'll take us a long time instead of flying, but often those are the best times. I mean, I can think of myself even playing soccer as a kid. During tournaments, we'd win these massive national tournaments, but I don't remember the games very much. What I remember is the time in between the games when we'd be at the hotel pool, or we had one kid who would put bubbles inside of fountains and make them fizz over, and we'd hide at a distance and laugh. Sorry to all the hotels and all the places we did that to. But again, those are the times when I remember. And that's what strengthened the bonds that helped while we were playing. I mean, really unconsciously, in me knowing that when I passed to a player, or even knowing where a player would be when. If I was playing center mid as a soccer player, I knew that my forward was making a run diagonally or he was checking to the ball. He didn't even have to communicate to me. So those are the things that strengthen it. After this experience for Phil begins to question his occupation as a coach. He has a player who is exceptional, but he cannot concentrate. For the life of Phil, everything he does for him, he still becomes like a middle-of-the-road player, even though he has the talent that he can see in practice to be an unbelievable NBA player, like one of the top in the league. So it makes this guy a development player. And Phil really battles with being a coach and seeing what is happening in the league and seeing what's happening with this player. Phil actually decides that he's going to go to law school. And this is at the end of 1986, the beginning of 1987. Phil says one of the main jobs of a coach is to reawaken that spirit so that the players can blend together effortlessly. It's often an uphill fight. The ego-driven culture of basketball and society in general militates against cultivating this kind of selfless action. Even for members of a team whose success as individuals is tied directly to the group performance. Our society places such a high premium on individual achievement, it's easy for players to get blinded by their own self importance and lose a sense of interconnectedness, the essence of teamwork. And just here, imagine if Phil went to law school. I mean, yes, he could become a great lawyer, which maybe he would have, but like we would lose greatness in the coaching and in the leading or in the leadership sector of our field that you and I care about. It just makes me reflect too of how many coaches were also on this path that have quit through becoming discouraged. How many more Phils could we have had to reference and learn from? Probably many, many more. And Phil is not isolated in this sentiment. I am 100% positive that every leader, every entrepreneur, every coach that we study, gosh, they also question that too, right? So you and I question it. I know I have, gosh, tens of moments throughout the year where I question doing what I'm doing, and I always come back to the good experiences and the love of coaching that I have. So as Phil is applying to law school and he's going to go to law school, Jerry Krause from the Bulls calls, and he calls not with the head coach job, but with an assistant coach job. Phil takes the job. He takes the assistant job, and he says he likes it because he's free to become a student of the game again and explain a wide range of new ideas. He tells his new wife at the time, June, that it will be like going to graduate school for basketball. And this is mainly because of Tex Winter, who has the triangle offense, who he knows about, and Johnny Bach, who concentrates more defensively. One of his early experiences that he has is pretty funny because he has this with not only the coach at the time, who is Doug Collins, but he also has this experience with Michael Jordan, who is like, the greatest athlete of all time. Well, sorry, he's the greatest athlete on the planet at the time. So he says, early on, I told the coaching staff about Red Holzman's axiom that the sign of a great player was not how much he scored, but how much he lifted his teammates' performance. Collins said excitedly, "You've got to tell that to Michael." I hesitated. "No, you've got to tell him that right now," Collins insisted. So I searched the gym and found Michael in the weight room chatting with the players. Slightly embarrassed, I repeated Holzman's adage, saying, "Doug thought you'd like to hear this." I expected Michael, who could be sarcastic, to dismiss the remark as a product of basketball's Stone Age. But instead, he thanked me and was genuinely curious about my experience with the championship Knicks. This is really neat. Phil Jackson is not the Phil Jackson that we know at the time, but he is a bit of an unknown. For Michael Jordan to know about his history as a Knicks player too, and maybe he was introduced that way, who knows, and that he won 2 championships. I mean, that's Michael's main drive, is to win championships. So at the time, Phil travels around the league scouting other teams. To his amazement, he realizes everyone is using the same mode of operation, power basketball. It was the main philosophy tactic in the 80s, which reinforced a self-centered approach to the game. There's a need for something different in the NBA, Phil thinks. And this need ushers in Tex Winter's triangle offense. Now, Tex Winter, again, he's a part of Doug Collins' staff, but Doug Collins doesn't use that offense at all. What he wants to do is to find ways to isolate Michael and to have Michael score all the points. Phil reflects on this and he says, well, the Bulls don't have power players. There needs to be an emphasis on speed, quickness, and finesse. And this is when the triangle offense comes into play more, just in Phil's mind, and it's percolating for when he becomes the head coach. Phil says, the triangle offense is best described as a 5-man Tai Chi. Of course, Phil would say that he compares it to Tai Chi. The basic idea is to orchestrate the flow of movement in order to lure the defense off balance and create a myriad of openings on the floor. The system gets its name from one of the most common patterns of movement, the sideline triangle. The point is not to go head-to-head with the defense, but to toy with the defenders and trick them into overextending themselves. That means thinking and moving in unison as a group and being acutely aware at any given moment of what's happening on the floor. Executed properly, the system is virtually unstoppable because there are no set plays, and the defense can't predict what's going to happen next. If the defense tries to prevent one move, the players will adjust this instinctively and start another series of cuts and passes that often lead to a better shot. At the heart of the system are what Tex calls the 7 principles
of a sound offense. And I'm going to read you the 7 principles here. Now, I'm not going to read you everything that goes into these principles. I'll read some a little bit, but what I'd like you to do is to get the book or to listen to the book and to read these because they're awesome. Principle 1, the offense must penetrate the defense. Principle 2, the offense must involve a full court game. Transition offense starts on defense. The players must be able to play end-to-end and perform skills at fast break pace. Principle 3, the offense must provide proper spacing. Principle 4, the offense must ensure player and ball movement with a purpose. Principle 5, the offense must provide strong rebounding position and good defensive balance on all shots. Principle 6, the offense must give the player with the ball an opportunity to pass the ball to any of his teammates. Principle 7, the offense must utilize the player's individual skills. What I like here is that this is highly adaptable, right? It's not as if we are saying, oh, I am just cemented in stone on this particular play or on these particular tactics. This seems to be extremely, extremely adaptable. And I do appreciate that about Phil. We'll see after Michael leaves a little bit later how he has to adapt the team again because he doesn't have this, again, the greatest athlete, to me, probably who has ever lived, but the greatest athlete at the time. Phil says, what appealed to me about the system was that it empowered everybody on the team by making them more involved in the offense and demanded that they put their individual needs second to those of the group. This is the struggle every leader faces: how to get members of the team who are driven by the quest for individual glory to give themselves over wholeheartedly to the group effort. In other words, how to teach them selflessness. This is a principle-driven system. The principles serve as a mirror that shows each player how well they're doing with respect to the team mission. Having a clearly defined set of principles to work with reduces conflicts because it depersonalizes the criticism. Learning the system is a demanding, often tedious process that takes years to master. The key is a repetitive series of drills. Oh, I love that. That train the player on an experiential level as well as an intellectual one. To move, as Tex puts it, like 5 fingers on a hand. In that respect, the drills resemble Zen practice. After months of focusing intently on performing the drills in practice, the players begin to see, aha, this is how all the pieces fit together. They develop an intuitive feel for how their movements and those of everyone else on the floor are interconnected. Most rookies arrive in the NBA thinking that what will make them happy is having unlimited freedom to strut their egos on national TV. But the approach to the game is an inherently empty experience. What makes basketball so exhilarating is the joy of losing yourself completely in the dance, even if it's just for one beautiful, transcendent moment. That's what the system teaches players. There's a lot of freedom built into the process, but it's the freedom that John Paxson talks about, the freedom of shaping a role for yourself and using all of your creative resources to do work in unison with others. When I started coaching, Dick Motta, a veteran NBA coach, told me that the most important part of the job takes place on the practice floor, not during the game. After a certain point, you have to trust the players to translate into action what they've learned in practice. Using a comprehensive system of basketball makes it easier for me to detach myself in that way. Once the players have mastered the system, a powerful group intelligence emerges that is greater than the coach's ideas or those of any individual on the team. During the 1988-89 season, the Bulls make it all the way to the conference championship, which they have done before. But Jerry Krause starts to lose faith in Doug Collins, and he lets him go. And what Jerry does is he hires Phil. Phil says, my first act after being named head coach of the Bulls was to formulate a vision for the team. I learned from the Lakota and my own experience as a coach that vision is the source of leadership, the expansive dream state where everything begins and all is possible. I started by creating a vivid picture in my mind of what the team could become. My vision could be lofty, I reminded myself, but it couldn't be a pipe dream. I had to take into account not only what I wanted to achieve, but how I was going to get there. And at the heart of my vision was the selfless ideal of teamwork. My goal was to give everyone on the team a vital role. Tex Winter's system would be my blueprint. But that alone wasn't going to be enough. We needed to reinforce the lessons the players were learning in practice to get them to embrace the concept of selflessness wholeheartedly. Just as fish don't fly and elephants don't play rock and roll, you can't expect a team to perform in a way that's out of tune with its basic abilities. You can dream all you want, but bottom line, you've got to go to work with what you've got. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. The team won't buy your plan, and everyone, most of all you, will end up frustrated and disappointed. But when your vision is based on a clear sighted, realistic assessment of your resources, alchemy often mysteriously occurs and a team transforms into a force greater than the sum of its individual talents. Inevitably, paradoxically, the acceptance of boundaries and limits is the gateway to freedom. Phil at this time has a discussion with Michael Jordan because he knows he has to. He knows that Doug Collins and him were very good buddies as well, and that Doug Collins relied a lot on him to generate scoring opportunities and play defense and all of that. But the problem was that at the end of games, Mike would be so tired that he couldn't perform as well. So Phil decides to discuss the triangle offense that they're going to be doing from now on with him, with Michael. And Michael goes, "Oh, you mean Texas equal opportunity offense?" Which I think throws Phil back a little bit, but not really. And Phil says, "Yes, it's going to be that offense." And after that discussion, to MJ's credit, he devotes himself to learning that system. It takes the team 18 months to get comfortable with the system, and it takes 2.5 years to master it. MJ even says himself that he still makes mistakes with it after several years of knowing it. And the system is really the starting point of the whole team becoming the Bulls as we knew them back in the 90s. One of the major things that Phil does too is to appoint Bill Cartwright as the captain. Bill has this uncanny ability to listen to people and to understand them and the intuitive sense to know what they need. After guiding players through principles and tactical systems, there's also a release of control that needs to happen with every team. Because it's a player's game and not a coach's game, we need to give control to the players. And we may think differently, but that's not really the case. And Phil understands this. Phil says some coaches feel threatened when their players start asserting their independence. But I think it's much more effective to open up the decision-making process to everybody. Each game is a riddle that must be solved, and there are no textbook answers. The players often have a better handle on the problem than the coaching staff because they're right in the thick of the action and can pick up intuitively the opposition's strengths and weaknesses. To reach that point, I had to give the players the freedom to find out what worked and what didn't. That meant putting them out on the floor together in unusual combinations and letting them deal with treacherous situations without bailing them out. Some players found this to be a maddening ordeal. B.J. Armstrong, a rookie point guard from the University of Iowa in 1989-90, was perplexed when I left him in games for long stretches, even though none of his shots were going in. I wanted to teach him that shooting wasn't the only thing that mattered. Defense was far more important. Eventually, he got the message and developed a broader view of what he could do for the team. Now we get into some of the practices that Phil tried and succeeded with at the Bulls. He said he tried many, many things and that many things went wrong, but these are actually the things that went right. And here's a pro tip for everybody. Phil often uses movie clips with game clips to lighten the mood when driving points home to players. It relieves pressure and it focuses the team. So he actually, the first one he mentions is from Wizard of Oz, and he kind of pokes fun at everybody while critiquing them. Like every single critique play that he videotaped for the players also has some sort of Wizard of Oz deal with it too. There's this great quote that he has from John Lee Williamson, which was one of Phil's teammates on the Knicks. He says, "Go down as you live. Don't hold back. Play the way you live your life with your whole heart and soul." And Phil relates this to playing with an open heart. Here's something that's kind of like this too from Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind within the book. It says, if your mind is empty, it is always ready for anything. It is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. And what this reminds me too is of Ray Dalio in his book Principles. He talks about hiring people right out of school, out of college or graduate school, because they're young, they're hungry, they have a lot of energy. He could care less about people with experience because they also bring bad habits and kind of a laziness that comes with being in a field and kind of knowing the routine. With young hunger, there's nothing that's impossible. Everything is possible. So this beginner's mind is hugely important for Phil and something he continues to try to teach the Bulls as he tries to reinvent them season after season. Phil says basketball is a complex dance that requires shifting from one objective to another at lightning speed. To excel, you need to act with a clear mind and be totally focused on what everyone on the floor is doing. The secret is not thinking. That doesn't mean being stupid.
It means quieting the endless jabbering of thoughts so that your body can do instinctively what it's been trained to do without the mind getting in the way. Robert Pirsig in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance writes about the peace of mind which does not separate oneself from one's surroundings. When that is done successfully, then everything else follows naturally. Peace of mind produces right values produce right thoughts produce right actions, and right actions produce right work, which will be a material reflection for others to see of the serenity at the center of it all. Phil then goes into meditation, and he brings in an expert named George Mumford to lead a 3-day mindfulness course during training camp. This is how Phil actually uses meditation. He says, little by little, with regular practice, you start to discriminate raw sensory events from your reactions to them. Eventually, you begin to experience a point of stillness within. As the stillness becomes more stable, you tend to identify less with fleeting thoughts and feelings such as fear, anger, or pain, and experience a state of inner harmony, regardless of changing circumstance. For me, meditation is a tool that allows me to stay calm and centered. Well, most of the time, he says, during the stressful highs and lows agitated by bad calls. But years of meditation practice have taught me how to find that still point within so that I can argue passionately with the refs without being overwhelmed by anger. Awareness is everything. Also, the experience of sitting silently together in a group tends to bring about a subtle shift in consciousness that strengthens the team bond. Sometimes we extend mindfulness to the court and conduct the whole practice in silence. The deep level of concentration and nonverbal communication that arises when we do this never fails to astonish me. Now, there's a couple things here. This reminds me also of Michael Phelps, who would train in the dark and count his strokes in swimming. I know it's not a team sport, but it's still a sport. And to rely on other sensory data is important here. And it's important for Michael Phelps, obviously, too. If he can count the strokes and do it blindfolded, then he can really focus on being in the moment as opposed to having his thoughts run wild. With meditation, too, I like that he says that he can figure out kind of the boiling point with the refs, and he can figure out what to argue and what not to. I know as a coach myself, sometimes I get in player mode and captain mode, and I start to banter with the refs so that we get the next 1 or 2 or 3 calls, and you can judge me for that if you want. I know it's youth sports, but I can get pretty passionate too. So in professional sports, I mean, where money is literally on the line and draft picks and championships and playoffs and all that stuff, it's important that you can get every little edge here. Visualization is also another key practice Phil introduced to the Bulls. Here's a quote from B.J. Armstrong on visualization. B.J. Armstrong is a 6'1" guard who is in the first three-peat championships and is not in the second three-peat of championships, which is why we focus on him a little bit in this book as well. He says, I believe that if I can take 20 or 30 minutes before each game and visualize what's going to happen, I'll be able to react to it without thinking, because I'll already have seen it in my mind. When I'm lying down before the game, I can see myself making a shot or boxing out or getting a loose ball. And then when I can see that come up during the game, I don't think about it, I do it. There are no second thoughts. No hesitation. And Phil himself usually does 45 minutes of visualization at home before every game to prepare his mind. He says, I usually call up images of the players in my mind and try to embrace them in the light. I think this is pretty unique and pretty neat. I've never really heard of a coach doing this. I've heard of spiritual practitioners doing it, but never a coach, to where it seems like he just wants the best for them, whatever that means. He's open to however that comes, but that he just wants them protected and that he wants them to be in their own light too, and basically show the skills that they have both mentally and physically on the court. Phil says another important aspect of what we do is create a supportive environment for the players where they feel secure and free from constant scrutiny. Although we maintain high standards, we do everything possible to prevent the players from feeling personally responsible when the team loses. So this is huge. I don't know, again, how much you know about soccer, and again, me being the soccer nerd, Manchester United, once they lost their all-time coach, Alex Ferguson, after being in charge for, I think it's over 25 years and maybe even more than that. But once they lose him, there's a huge void to fill because he was essentially the club. And whenever a club loses that, they try to replace him with one manager, and really it can't be done. So the expectations are super high. And to this day, 12, 13 years later, Manchester United are a shell of themselves, of what they used to be. They're a lot like the Dallas Cowboys, where in the 90s they were amazing, and now they are once again a shell of themselves, and they have been for a while. I guess you could also say that with the Bulls. Once Phil Jackson leaves, they can't replace him, and they haven't been to a championship since then, not let alone win a championship. Phil also talks about in the same breath, I like to introduce them to ideas outside the realms of the game, show them that there's more to life than basketball, and more to basketball than basketball. I found that the connection will be deeper and last longer if it's built on a foundation of genuine exchange. One way we do that is to talk regularly about ethics. I pass out a handbook that's a modern-day reinterpretation of the 10 Commandments. During practices, one of the players will read a section from the book to stimulate group discussion. Another way I expand the players' minds is by giving them books to read on road trips. And he gives all sorts of books. He gives Charlotte's Web. Yeah, if you've watched the show Ted Lasso, I know Ted Lasso does the same thing, but I think that's where we get it here, is Phil Jackson giving separate books to people. I know he gives the art and practice of motorcycle maintenance to John Paxson. Gosh, I'm trying to remember what he gives BJ Strong. I'm not going to remember it. But he does give certain things. He gives Stacey King some fun one, and he gives John Sally one about New York and the inner city and in high school how the New York high school teams were actually cheating at the time, and there was a big scandal, and he knows that John Sally's from New York, so he enjoyed it also. John Sally's a huge reader himself. Phil here says, make your work play and your play work. Basketball is a form of play, of course, but it's easy for players to lose sight of this because of the pressures of the job. As a result, my primary goal during practice is to get the players to reconnect with their intrinsic joy of the game. And we're going to move back to what's actually happening with the team. In 1990, the team finally started to click. At first, some of the players were skeptical about the triangle offense. B.J. Armstrong, for one, couldn't believe that it was the answer to every defense imaginable, as Tex Winter claimed. But when we started winning consistently, the players changed their tune. What they liked most about the system was that it was democratic. It created shots for everyone, not just the superstars. The system gives us direction, keeps us all on the same page, B.J. said. If you're just running plays for individuals, that separates you from one another. If it's play X, you know who's going to shoot all the time, and pretty soon you're like a dog that's getting hit. You don't want to do it because there's no incentive for you. But in the system, anyone can shoot, anyone can score, anyone can make the pass. The system responds to whoever is open. And systems take time. They need to be adapted to the environment. Buy-in is a must here. Experience and struggle are important initiations. Ownership is developed when we choose to engage. If we have players that don't engage in it, man, it is a struggle. So when Mikel Arteta took over Arsenal, quickly he really started to sell a lot of the players that weren't buying into the system. Even if they were some of his very, very good up-and-coming players, he just started getting rid of them. And he would have these talks with players before they got transferred into the club, which a lot of managers, they don't speak to the players before they get transferred. He would, to make sure that they were a good fit. And right now, as far as Arsenal goes, he has a killer team. I mean, every single position has 2 players, maybe even 3 players battling it out. He also has gems coming from his academy system too. So he's really showing this, that he put in a system and he was very, very, very demonstrative about that system. He had to have it done his way. And if you weren't willing to do it, then you were out. He shows that a lot in practice. I mean, if you watch his training, he is very engaged in training. And nowadays, there's a lot of managers like this, especially the ones that are young and have energy to do it. They do it. So Phil is also part of this too. He does it a little bit differently because he's just got a different personality. Maybe it's not as fiery. And as we've seen, it is pretty fiery. But in the games, he's more stoic than somebody like Arteta or Guardiola or other soccer coaches that we've seen that are particularly Spanish that are on the sidelines. But if you don't have buy-in, it doesn't matter what system you have. You can't do it. It doesn't work. You have to have buy-in. And even players who are better than other players, if the better player doesn't have that buy-in, but the player who is more of maybe a team player has that, that's the player you want. You don't want the one who's going to be a maverick who goes off on their own. You do want the players who do things that are creative. that are indispensable on the court, like Michael Jordan when he decides to take over. But he can't do that every single game. Otherwise, teams are just going to cue into him. His teammates aren't going to want to play. There's a lot that goes downhill after that. So at this point, the Bulls know they can get to the conference championship, but they can't get past the Detroit Pistons, the bad boys of basketball. Now, at the time, Detroit had what are called the Jordan rules. And the Jordan rules are basically when Michael drives to the basket, they're going to foul him, and they're going to foul him hard. And they're always going to double and triple team him, and they're going to make sure that his life is a living nightmare. They don't want him to get up, meaning that they don't want him to jump. John Sally has this great quote in The Last Dance that he can't let Michael jump because, he's not human. Essentially, he's an alien. When he jumps, he can go anywhere with the ball. He gets fouled. He still puts it in the basket. So they don't want him to get airborne. Phil says, that summer in Montana, I realized that anger was the Bulls' real enemy, not the Detroit Pistons. Anger was the restless demon that seized the group mind and kept the players from being fully awake. Whenever we went to Detroit, the unity and awareness we'd worked so hard to build collapsed, and the players reverted to their most primitive instincts. It was how they'd originally been trained to play the game. Win or die was the code. Rousing the players' anger and bloodlust was the method. But that kind of approach interferes with concentration and ultimately backfires. It also stinks as a blueprint for competition. St. Augustine said, anger is a weed, hate is the tree. So Phil starts to brainstorm that summer, and he says here, it's kind of an open brainstorm inside of his book, which is really neat. He says, there has to be another way, an approach that honors the humanity of both sides while recognizing that one victor can emerge. A blueprint for giving your all out of respect for the battle, never hatred of the enemy. Their first instinct was to try and use force to solve every problem. What I tried to do was get them to walk away from confrontations and not let themselves be distracted. If somebody fouled them hard, I suggested turning around, taking a deep breath, and staying as composed as possible so they could keep their minds fixed on the goal, victory. The system reinforces this perspective. The strength of the triangle offense is that it's based on the Taoist principle of yielding to an opponent's force in order to render him powerless. If you look hard enough, you'll find his weaknesses. Bottom line, there's no need to overpower when you can outsmart. For the strategy to work, all 5 players have to be moving in sync so that they can take advantage of the openings that occur when the defense overextends itself. If one player gets caught in a tussle with his man, resisting the pressure rather than moving away from it, he can jam up the whole system. Teaching the players to embrace a non-belligerent way of thinking about competition required continuous reinforcement. I caution the players not to get too excited about victories or too depressed about defeats. When we lost, I'd say, okay, let's flush that one down the drain when you shower. Let's not lose 2 in a row. I also warned the team about becoming complacent with a 3-game winning streak. If they let the momentum build, they could extend a streak to 8, 9, 10 games. Winning started to come naturally. It's not just about teaching what to do with anger for Phil. He also works with it constantly because, as we can see, he was a competitive person. He did get angry. He was in tears when he lost as a kid. And even moving into college and professional sports, he had that about him. So he says, as a rule, I try not to unleash my anger at players that way. When it happens, I say what I have to say, then I let it pass, so the bad feelings won't linger in the air and poison the team. Sometimes what my father called righteous anger is the most skillful means to shake up a team, but it has to be dispensed judiciously, and it's got to be genuine. If you're not really angry, the players will detect it immediately. Most importantly, eruptions shouldn't be directed at 1 or 2 members of a group. They should encompass the whole pack. The Bulls make it all the way to the conference championship where Detroit is waiting for them again. And in Game 4, Dennis Rodman shoved Pippen into the stands so hard, it took him a few seconds to stagger to his feet. As he got up, Horace rushed over and screamed, "You play! You play!" Scotty shrugged it off and kept playing. Scotty says here, we put our main focus into basketball, as we have all season. And Scotty wasn't alone here. Everybody on the team was slammed around. John Paxson was thrown into the stands by Lambeer. Other players were tackled, tripped, elbowed, and smacked in the face. But they all laughed it off. The Pistons didn't know how to respond. Phil says we completely disarmed them by not striking back. At that moment, our players became true champions. The Bulls went on to win the championship in 5 games versus the Lakers. And after game 4, Magic Johnson has this great quote. He says, "It's not just Michael. He's going great, but so is the team. It's one thing if he's going great and the team isn't. Then you have a chance to win. They've got Horace playing well, Bill playing solid, and their bench is playing outstanding. They've got the total game going." Phil says after winning that championship that it was surreal and it was like something out of a movie that he was removed from. As a player, he wasn't as removed from it. If you remember, he had 2 or 3 days that he'd celebrate, and then he thought, well, is this it to life? And there must be more to life. So he has a kind of on delay. But as soon as they win it, he thought, this is the Players' Championship. Like it's their thing. And so it doesn't affect him emotionally as much as you might think it would. And, winning your first championship as a coach, something you're striving so hard year after year to do. Phil really likes the idea of being an invisible leader. And he talks about a value-based management and how closely it resembles his style of leadership. These type of leaders listen carefully to their followers out of a deep respect for them as individuals and develop a vision that they will embrace because it is based on their highest aspirations. To be effective, leaders must begin by setting aside that culturally conditioned natural instinct to lead by push, particularly when times are tough. Leaders must instead adopt the unnatural behavior of always leading by the pull of inspiring values. Phil talks about his approach with the Bulls, and he says that it's one that follows a middle path. Rather than coddling players or making their lives miserable, we try to create a supportive environment that structures the way they relate to each other and gives them the freedom to realize their potential. I also try to cultivate everybody's leadership abilities to make the players and coaches feel that they've all got a seat at the table. No leader can create a successful team alone, no matter how gifted he is. The Bulls have a run of success over the next 2 years, and they achieve what's called a three-peat. They win 3 straight championships in a row, including the one above against the Lakers. Here are some of Phil's major takeaways from those years. He says, during the championship years, the most important leaders were Bill Cartwright and Michael Jordan. I relied on them to solve minor problems and give me an accurate reading of what was going on with the team. Once during the 1992-93 season, the team went into a slump, losing 4 out of 5 games, our worst slide in 2 years. The game was against the Utah Jazz, always a tough opponent. On the plane to Salt Lake City, I asked Bill and Michael what they thought we could do to revive the team. They said that some of the players had split themselves off from the group, and I should do something to bring them back together. Bill and Michael were especially concerned about Scotty and Horace, who had recently cooled toward one another after being close friends for so many years. It was Super Bowl Sunday. When we arrived at the hotel, I told players to get some pizzas and beers after practice and watch the Super Bowl in their hotel rooms. You guys need to get together and remember what you're doing this for, I said. You're not doing it for the money. It may seem that way, but that's just an external reward. You're doing it for the internal rewards. You're doing it for each other and the love of the game. Michael had a lively Super Bowl party in his room that afternoon, and the players reconnected. The next day, they came alive, erasing a 17-point deficit in the fourth quarter to beat Utah 96-92. After that, they settled down and cruised through the rest of the season. Phil has a really good way of dealing with the media, and I've listened to a lot of coaches talk about how they deal with the media. A lot of them do not like it. But what he says, I try to play the stories down with the media. Once the season starts, I don't pay much attention to the news unless a big problem crops up that I have to address. Whenever a big story develops, I try to laugh it off in front of the players to show them that I don't consider what appears in the papers to be very important. When you're young and in the public eye, it's easy to get caught up in fame's seductive web. But the truth is the players aren't fighting for the media or the public. They're fighting for the inner circle of the team. Anyone outside that circle who can destroy the team harmony has to be handled with care. This is pretty unique. I've never really heard a coach in any autobiography, interview, biography, anything like that, deal with media in the same way that they say that they're not fighting against the media themselves. They're fighting for the team itself. I love that. It puts emphasis on the team again. Phil really likes, as we've heard before, to create a team environment where it's the 12 players and the coaching staff. They are the inner circle, and that is it. And they need to make sure that that inner circle stays tight. If things start to squeeze in through that inner circle, it can get really, really bad. When he does have conflict between players, he deals with it in a very specific way. He says, though some coaches try to settle differences in team meetings, I prefer to deal with them on an individual basis. This helps strengthen my one-on-one connection with the players, who sometimes get neglected because we spend so much of our time together en masse. Meeting with players privately helps me stay in touch with who they are out of uniform. When you're a leader, you have to be able to read accurately the subtle messages players send out. To do that means being fully present with beginner's mind. Over the years, I've learned to listen closely to players, not just to what they say, but also to their body language and the silence between the words. I find it amusing when people ask me where I get my ideas from. The answer is, in the moment. When a problem arises, I try to read the situation as accurately as possible and respond spontaneously to whatever's happening. You have to trust your inner knowing. If you have a clear mind and an open heart, you won't have to search for direction. Direction will come to you. Very neat quote here. It also resonates to me with Jurgen Klopp, the former Liverpool manager, and what he says. He says, I'm not here to get, I'm here to give, meaning his energy, that he's very open to players coming to him with concerns, personal problems, that type of thing, and he's open to give them what they need. And a lot of times that's the energy. It's a positive outlook. It's a positive environment. It's giving them an uplifting presence so that they can get out of or feel like they can get out of mentally whatever they're going through. And we're back to BJ here. He says, the untold story of the Bulls, says Armstrong, is the respect each individual has for everybody else. Phil then will go on to say, good teams become great ones when the members trust each other enough to surrender the me for the we. This is the lesson Michael and his teammates learned en route to winning 3 consecutive NBA championships. As Bill Cartwright puts it, a great basketball team will have trust. I've seen teams in this league where the players won't pass to a guy because they don't think he's going to catch the ball. But a great basketball team will throw the ball to everyone. If a guy drops it or bobbles it out of bounds, the next time they'll throw it to him again. And because of their confidence in him, he will have confidence. That's how you grow. I love this quote because what a lot of teams will do is to try to hide their worst players, or they'll try to hide the people who can't handle the ball or hit the ball or whatever sport it is. But Phil doesn't actually believe in this. As he said before in one of his quotes, he will leave BJ Armstrong on the court even if he's having a cold night and even if BJ doesn't understand it, because he's not worried about that. He's worried more about the effort and the concentration he's giving. After the 3rd championship that the Bulls win, MJ decides to retire from basketball and go play baseball. Phil leads the chapter with this quote. Achin Cha, a Laotian forest monk, said, "You see this globe? For me, this glass is already broken. I enjoy it. I drink out of it. It holds my water admirably, sometimes even reflecting the sun in beautiful patterns. If I should tap it, it has a lovely ring to it. But when I put this glass on a shelf and the wind knocks it over, or my elbow brushes it off the table and it falls to the ground and shatters, I say, of course. When I understand that this glass is already broken, every moment with it is precious." Phil says, in its simplicity, this story illustrates one of the basic principles of Buddhist teachings, that impermanence is a fundamental fact of life. So it is, the tale seems to be saying, for everything from crystal goblets to championship basketball teams. It wasn't until Michael Jordan left the Bulls in the fall of 1993 that I began to see what we'd really accomplished and how all the pieces of our style of coaching fit together. It was a new season, and though many of the players remained, it was a new team. The challenge was not to try to repeat ourselves, but to use what we had learned to recreate ourselves, to conjure up a new vision for this team. He says, what's exciting about coaching is the building process, not the ongoing maintenance work required once your team has achieved success. During Michael's final season, the Bulls ran pretty much on automatic. The biggest problem I faced was keeping the players from getting bored and losing their edge. Now I would get a chance to reshape the team and see if our approach to the game would work without the world's greatest player on the roster. When Jordan leaves, other people want to step up to fill the void, and Tony Kukoc tries to do this. Phil says here that Tony wasn't a selfish player. Nothing gave him more pleasure than to dish the ball to somebody else. But he didn't want to conform to the triangle offense. I knew right from the start that I would have to ride him hard in practice to protect him from being torn apart by his teammates. I'm sure my method didn't seem like an act of kindness to Tony. He couldn't understand why I allowed Scotty the freedom to make creative moves outside the system, but would start yelling at him when he tried similar gambits. The difference, I told him, was that Scotty was looking at the game from a completely different perspective. He had spent years working within the offense, so when he decided to step outside of it, he usually had a good reason. But when Tony bucked the system, it was because he was impatient and wanted to assert his individuality, often at the team's expense. The team actually has a great season this year, and Phil says it's one of his most fun seasons that he has. He says, that was my favorite season that we didn't come away with a trophy. This is the year after Jordan retires. I was pleased with the way the players had transcended the loss of Jordan and turned themselves into a real team. 3 championships had taught them a lot. On paper, they may not have been as talented as their rivals, but they had an unshakable collective will that won them a lot of close games. They expected to win the big ones, even when they were outgunned, and that alone often carried them to victory. I realized that the new team would take time to evolve into a cohesive whole. My challenge was to be patient. There's no point in trying to push the river or speed up the harvest. The farmer who's so eager to help his crops grow that he slips out at night and tugs on the shoots inevitably ends up going hungry. There's still something really big missing here that Phil notices, and that's competitive drive. He says, my reading of the situation was that, as a group, the team didn't have an overwhelming desire to win, and that's something you just can't teach. Then Jordan returned. The effect on the team from the very first practice was electric. The players, most of whom who had never played with Michael before, were thrilled about the prospect of his return, and the level of competition at practice rose instantly. Even though he wasn't in game shape, Michael challenged everybody to step up. Now, Michael ends up returning completely from baseball. He quits baseball, he goes into playing basketball again, but the Bulls were never really synced that season. At the end of this first season with Michael back, Phil reflects, the new players never got to know Michael intimately, nor he them, and that eventually undermined the team's performance on the court. Basketball is a sport that involves the subtle interweaving of players at full speed to the point where they are thinking and moving as one. To do that successfully, they need to trust each other on a deep level and know instinctively how their teammates will respond in pressure situations. A great player can only do so much on his own, no matter how breathtaking his one-on-one moves are. If he is out of sync psychologically with everyone else, the team will never achieve the harmony needed to win a championship. There's a passage from Rudyard Kipling's Second Jungle Book that I often read during the playoffs to remind the team of this basic principle. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky, and the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runneth forward and back, for the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Phil has to deal with losing, and it's not that he hasn't lost before, but winning 3 championships and then getting all the way to the conference championship, and then, going into the playoffs again the year after with Jordan, but then losing again, he has to deal with losses. And on losing, he says, this is after, again, Jordan comes back and he loses. He says, on losing, this time I was determined not to dance away from reality, but to make it my teacher. Losing is a lens which you can see yourself more clearly and experience in the blood and bones the transient nature of life. The day after the final game, the coaches and I got together at the Berto Center and did a post-mortem. Then over the next few days, Jerry Krause and I met with each player individually to discuss the season and see how they were handling the loss. As we talked, a vision of the future started forming in my mind. I could imagine a new incarnation of the Bulls built around the new Michael Jordan, now an elder statesman, not a young rambunctious warrior. He says on winning that winning is important to me, but what brings me real joy is the experience of being fully engaged in whatever I'm doing. I get unhappy when my mind begins to wander, during wins as well as losses. Sometimes a well-played defeat will make me feel much better than a victory in which the team doesn't feel especially connected. This hasn't always been the case. As a young player, winning meant everything to me. My sense of self-worth rose and fell depending on my personal performance and how my team stacked up. In 1978, my last year with the Knicks, we were swept by Philadelphia in the playoffs. After the next to last game, Doug Collins, then a player with the 76ers, came over to shake my hand, but I snubbed him. June, his second wife, who was watching from the stands, couldn't believe her eyes. I explained that the series wasn't over yet, and I wasn't prepared to acknowledge defeat. She thought that was ridiculous. Doug wasn't trying to one-up me. He just wanted to congratulate me for a good game. My obsession with winning had robbed me of my joy in the dance. From that point on, I started looking at competition differently. I realized that I'd been trapped for years on an emotional roller coaster of winning and losing, and it was tearing me apart. Phil says overall, the team with the greatest dedication, desire, and single-minded effort ends up winning. And here's where we'll end the episode. That was Sacred Hoops by Phil Jackson. It goes through his adolescence, his childhood, up to college, and through his adventures in coaching, even into Puerto Rico, and the first three-peat with the Bulls, the Bulls season where Jordan comes back. It even goes into a little bit of getting Rodman onto the team, which I didn't go into. But we'll definitely do Phil again. There is a book called 11 Rings that I've read twice now, and I really want to do a podcast on. So we'll definitely circle back. But I hope you enjoyed Sacred Hoops. This is just one episode of many, many, many to come. Thank you very much.